A violent storm tore through the forest, ripping old pine trees from the ground. After the storm passed, a veteran Navy SEAL and his German shepherd went to check the familiar trail near their cabin. Suddenly, the dog stopped, sniffed the air, and turned toward the deeper forest. Trusting his K9 partner, the soldier followed through fallen trees and dense woods. Then they saw it, a massive rusted metal structure barely visible above the soil. Ancient pine roots had wrapped around it, as if the forest had tried to hide the secret for decades. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to The Last Command. 9. The forest in northern Washington had a way of swallowing sound. On most nights, even the wind seemed to lose its courage before entering the thick stands of old pines that surrounded the small wooden cabin, tucked deep between the ridges. The trees were tall enough to turn moonlight into thin silver threads that barely reached the forest floor. But that night, the silence felt different. Not peaceful, watchful. Declan Voss noticed it the moment he stepped out onto the creaking porch boards of his cabin. Declan was 43 years old, tall and broad-shouldered at roughly 6'1". Even after leaving the Navy, his posture still carried the quiet discipline of a man who had spent decades moving through dangerous places. His body was built like someone who had never truly stopped training. Lean muscle, thick forearms, shoulders that filled the worn olive field jacket he wore even in mild weather. His face was sharp and weathered, with a strong jawline and light stubble along his cheeks and chin. Years of sun had darkened his skin into a permanent bronze, and faint lines around his eyes suggested both patience and exhaustion. His hair was short and dark brown, trimmed in a practical military cut, with strands of gray already touching the temples. Declan wasn't a man who spoke much. Most people in the nearby town had learned that quickly. But anyone who paid attention would notice something else about him. He watched everything. The forest, the weather, people. Silence had become his natural language. And tonight, the silence felt wrong. Behind him, the screen door creaked again. Atlas had stepped outside. The German shepherd was 8 years old now, an experienced K9 who had once served beside Declan during his years in the Navy SEAL teams. Atlas had the balanced build typical of working shepherds. Powerful but lean, muscles tight beneath a dense black and tan coat. His back was mostly black, while his chest and legs carried deep golden fur that caught the faint moonlight. His eyes were dark, alert, and unsettlingly intelligent. The kind of eyes that didn't just look at the world. They studied it. Atlas didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply froze. His ears stood rigid. His body leaned slightly forward, and his gaze locked onto the darkness between the trees. Declan followed the dog's line of sight. "What is it?" he murmured quietly. Atlas didn't move. Declan had seen that posture before, many times, in deserts, in abandoned compounds, in places where stepping 1 meter too far meant death. It was Atlas's warning stance, not panic, not aggression, recognition. The dog had sensed something real. Declan leaned his forearms on the porch railing and listened. At first there was nothing, no wind, no rustling leaves, no owls. Just the deep, endless quiet of the forest. Then, a sound, so faint that it almost didn't exist. A metallic vibration. It was low and brief, like a steel cable humming somewhere beneath the earth. The sound lasted no more than 3 seconds. Then it vanished. Declan straightened slowly. Atlas's ears twitched. The dog remained fixed on the same direction in the woods. Declan scanned the darkness again. Probably a fallen branch, he muttered, though he didn't quite believe it. Atlas still didn't move. Declan sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. The habit came from old tension he never quite shook. Years ago, before he came to live here, Declan Voss had led assault teams through cities half a world away. He had spent more nights awake than asleep, learning how to read small signals, broken windows, unusual silence, a dog barking too suddenly. Those instincts never really disappeared, but life here had been quieter. He had bought the cabin 3 years ago after leaving the Navy. The place sat deep within a section of forest rarely visited except by hunters or hikers who knew the old trails. It was remote enough that some winter storms cut off the dirt road entirely. Most people would have called the isolation unbearable. Declan called it necessary. The town 20 miles south barely knew him. To them, he was just the tall former soldier who bought supplies once every 2 weeks and spoke politely but briefly. They didn't know the rest. They didn't know why he had left the military earlier than expected, or why he preferred silence to conversation. Atlas shifted slightly. Declan noticed. The dog's muscles remained tense. Whatever Atlas had heard or felt had not passed. Declan crouched beside him. The German shepherd was calm but focused, nose lifted slightly toward the windless air. "You smell something?" Declan asked quietly. Atlas didn't answer, of course, but the dog blinked slowly and continued staring into the woods. Declan rested one hand on the shepherd's neck. The fur was warm and thick. For a moment, memories crept back. Heat, dust, gunfire, a crumbling building in a desert city, Atlas barking, Declan waving the team forward anyway. Then, the explosion. Declan inhaled slowly and pushed the memory away. The past had a habit of creeping in when nights grew too quiet. He scratched Atlas gently behind the ear. "Relax," he murmured. But Atlas didn't relax. 5 minutes passed. Then something strange happened. Atlas lowered his head and pressed one paw against the wooden porch floor. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Not to the forest, to the ground. Declan frowned. "What are you doing?" Atlas froze again, and then, for the briefest instant, Declan felt it too. Not a sound, a vibration. So faint it was more like a suggestion than a sensation, a subtle tremor through the wooden boards beneath his boots. Then it stopped. Atlas lifted his head again and stared into the forest. Declan slowly stood. Now he wasn't sure what bothered him more, the vibration itself, or the fact that Atlas had sensed it first. Declan remained on the porch for several more minutes, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The pines stood silent and unmoving beneath the moon. Finally, he exhaled and stepped back inside the cabin. Atlas followed, but reluctantly. The dog paused once more at the threshold, glancing toward the forest before stepping through the doorway. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. Declan's gear hung neatly along one wall. Ropes, a hunting rifle, climbing equipment, and a battered olive backpack resting beside the table. Everything had its place. That was how Declan preferred it. Order kept the mind quiet. Atlas settled on the rug near the door, but even lying down, the shepherd remained alert. His ears twitched at every faint sound. Declan noticed. "You're not letting this go, huh?" Atlas blinked once. Declan walked to the small window and looked out again. Darkness. Nothing else. But somewhere beneath those trees, something had moved. Something metallic. Something deep underground. Declan turned off the cabin lights and sat down in the wooden chair near the window. Atlas didn't sleep. Neither did Declan. and outside the forest remained silent. 2 days later, Declan Voss would discover what had made that sound. But tonight, all he knew was this: Atlas had heard it first. And Atlas was rarely wrong. Morning arrived slowly in the northern forest. Thin bands of pale sunlight slipped between the tall pines, painting long shadows across the damp earth. The air carried the cool scent of moss and wet bark, the kind of smell that belonged only to places untouched by highways or crowded towns. Inside the small wooden cabin, Declan Voss was already awake. He had slept little. Declan stood by the narrow kitchen counter, one hand resting on a chipped enamel mug filled with black coffee that had already gone cold. The window beside him looked out toward the endless wall of trees beyond the clearing. In daylight, the forest appeared calm again, almost peaceful. But Declan knew better than to trust appearances. He was 43 years old, though the years of combat had added a quiet heaviness to his posture that made him seem older when he thought no one was watching. His frame was tall and powerful, built from decades of endurance training and long deployments. His shoulders filled the olive field jacket he wore almost every day, the fabric faded at the edges from years of use. The jacket had once belonged to another SEAL on his team. Declan had never told anyone that. His face was sharp and weathered, with the kind of angles that spoke of stubborn resilience rather than comfort. Dark stubble covered his jaw and chin, and faint scars along his cheekbone hinted at moments that had come too close to ending differently. But it was his eyes people noticed most. A deep blue-gray, calm, watchful. The eyes of someone who had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself. Behind him, Atlas lifted his head from the floor. The German shepherd had been lying beside the cabin door since before sunrise. Even now, after the quiet night had passed, the dog remained alert. Atlas was 8 years old enough that his muzzle carried the first faint strands of silver among the golden fur. His coat was thick and dense, black across the back and shoulders with warm tan coloring along his chest and legs. He was no ordinary pet. Atlas had spent nearly his entire life working. Even now in the quiet forest far from war zones, the shepherd moved with the steady composure of a trained K9. His body was balanced and muscular, built for endurance rather than brute strength. Most telling of all were his eyes. They never stopped studying the world. Declan glanced down at him. "You're still thinking about last night, huh?" Atlas blinked once but didn't move. Declan took a slow sip of his cold coffee. The events of the previous night lingered in his mind. The sound, that faint metallic vibration. Declan had spent years learning the difference between imagination and instinct. The sound hadn't been imagined. Something had caused it. But the forest outside looked exactly the same as it had the day before. And the day before that. Declan stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under his boots. He breathed deeply. The morning air carried the distant sound of a woodpecker somewhere far beyond the ridge. Nothing unusual. Still, something in the back of his mind refused to settle. Declan had once been the kind of man who could walk into hostile territory and remain calm under fire. But quiet mysteries were different. They left too much room for doubt. He leaned against the porch railing and studied the trees again. Maybe it was just a rock shift, he muttered. The region wasn't immune to small geological movements. The mountains around this part of Washington were old and restless in their own slow way. Still, Atlas rose and stepped beside him. The dog's head turned toward the deeper part of the forest. Declan noticed. "You hear it again?" Atlas didn't bark. He simply watched. Declan rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had never managed to break after leaving the military. 3 years had passed since he walked away from the Navy. 3 years since the mission in the desert city that had ended everything. Declan had spent more than 2 decades serving as a SEAL. His career had been filled with operations that most people would never hear about. He had led teams into places that existed only as coordinates on classified maps. He had trusted men with his life, and they had trusted him with theirs. That trust had been the foundation of everything. Until the day it broke. The memory came back in fragments, as it always did. A narrow street, a damaged building, Atlas barking sharply at the doorway, Declan raising his hand to silence him. The intelligence briefing had said the structure was clear. Declan had believed it. He had believed it more than the instincts of the dog beside him. Then the explosion, dust, fire, and the sound of one of his men screaming before the radio went silent. Declan closed his eyes briefly. Atlas had dragged him clear of the collapsing hallway. But one man hadn't made it out. Sergeant Michael Rivera. Declan still saw Rivera's face sometimes when he tried to sleep. The guilt never faded. It only grew quieter. Atlas nudged his hand. Declan looked down. The dog was watching him now, head tilted slightly. "You always know when I'm thinking about that, don't you?" Atlas blinked slowly. Declan scratched behind the dog's ear. The shepherd leaned into the touch. For a moment, the forest seemed peaceful again. Then Atlas suddenly stiffened. His ears snapped forward. Declan noticed instantly. "What is it?" Atlas stepped off the porch. Not fast, not panicked, just deliberate. Declan followed him into the clearing. The dog walked several steps into the grass and stopped. He sniffed the air, then he lowered his nose toward the ground. Declan crouched beside him. "Find something?" Atlas moved a few feet forward and sniffed again. The earth still looked undisturbed. But the dog's attention was fixed. Declan frowned. Atlas rarely focused this intensely without reason. Atlas suddenly placed one paw firmly against the soil. Then another. He remained perfectly still. Declan watched closely. The dog's ears twitched, and for the briefest moment, Atlas lifted his head and looked directly at Declan. Not toward the forest, not toward any scent. At him. The expression in the dog's eyes wasn't fear. It was certainty. Then Atlas turned his gaze toward a narrow section of forest Declan had never explored. A place where the trees grew thicker and the ground dipped slightly beyond the ridge. Declan felt a quiet tension settle in his chest. Atlas wasn't reacting randomly. He was choosing a direction, and that meant something had changed. Declan stood slowly. "Well," he muttered, glancing toward the tree line. "Guess we're going for a walk." Atlas had already begun moving. The shepherd stepped carefully toward the deeper forest, pausing every few feet to check the ground or sniff the air. Declan grabbed his worn leather gloves from his pocket and followed. The terrain beyond the clearing grew rough quickly, fallen. Branches from the recent storm littered the forest floor, forcing them to step carefully around twisted limbs and exposed roots. The trees here were older, thicker. The sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Declan noticed something else. The soil looked freshly disturbed in places, not dug, shifted, as if the earth itself had moved slightly during the storm. Atlas continued forward without hesitation. The deeper they went, the more Declan felt that strange sensation again. Not fear, anticipation. The feeling that something hidden had been waiting a long time to be found. Finally, Atlas stopped. The dog stood completely still, his gaze fixed ahead. Declan stepped beside him. The ground sloped downward into a shallow depression between several large pines. At first, Declan saw nothing unusual. Then the sunlight shifted slightly, and something beneath the soil caught the light. A dull metallic surface, half buried. Declan froze. The metal was dark with rust, barely visible beneath. Tangled roots and collapsed dirt, but its shape was unmistakable. It was not natural, not wood, not rock. Declan stepped closer, brushing dirt away with his boot. More metal appeared, curved, thick, industrial. Atlas stood beside him silently. Declan knelt and touched the surface. Cold steel, weathered by decades. Declan exhaled slowly. "What the hell is this?" Atlas didn't move, but his eyes remained fixed on the metal beneath the earth. Something had been buried here for a very long time. And somehow, the storm had uncovered it. The wind had done its work. 2 nights earlier, the storm had moved across the northern Washington forest like a restless giant. Pines had bent and groaned under its weight. Rain hammered the ground for hours, and somewhere deep in the hills, the earth had shifted in ways that no one in the nearby town would ever notice. But the forest remembered. Branches still lay scattered across the trails, snapped like matchsticks. Several old trees had fallen entirely, their massive roots ripped from the ground and exposed to the open air. Declan Voss stood beside the shallow depression in the forest floor and stared at the rusted metal emerging from the soil. Atlas stood close to him, silent. The German shepherd's body was rigid but calm, the posture of a trained K9, evaluating a threat that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. His black and tan coat caught small streaks of sunlight breaking through the pine canopy above. Declan crouched slowly and brushed dirt away with his gloved hand. The metal surface beneath the soil was curved, not flat, not the shape of machinery someone might leave behind. This was something larger, something designed. His fingers traced the rough surface. Cold steel, weathered by time. Declan leaned closer and cleared more of the dirt. More metal appeared, thicker than he expected. Industrial. Atlas stepped forward cautiously, nose twitching as he examined the ground near the exposed structure. Declan noticed how carefully the dog moved. Atlas wasn't panicked, but he was cautious. That meant one thing: uncertainty. Declan sat back on his heels. "Well," he muttered quietly, scanning the surrounding trees. Someone didn't want this to be found. He stood and studied the terrain around the depression. The storm had clearly triggered a small landslide. The slope above them had shifted slightly, sending loose soil downward and exposing the hidden structure. If the storm hadn't happened, this metal would still be buried. Atlas lowered his nose to the ground and followed a faint scent along the edge of the exposed steel. Declan followed his gaze. The dog paused near a thick root system where the soil had been peeled away. Declan stepped closer. That's when he noticed something. The metal wasn't just a random object. It had seams, panels, sections that looked almost engineered. Declan wiped away more dirt. A faint rectangle appeared in the metal surface. A hatch. Declan's breath slowed. "All right," he said quietly. "Now this is interesting." Atlas let out a low rumble, not a growl, not quite. A warning. Declan glanced down at him. "You don't like it." Atlas's ears tilted forward. The shepherd stared at the metal. Declan had learned long ago that Atlas rarely reacted without reason. He stood and scanned the forest again. Nothing moved. No distant engine sounds, no footsteps, no signs of human presence. But the metal structure beneath the earth didn't belong here by accident. Declan walked slowly around the depression, stepping carefully over broken branches and loose soil. As he circled the site, the shape of the buried object became clearer. The exposed section curved downward beneath the earth, which meant most of it was still hidden. He guessed the visible portion alone was at least 15 feet long, possibly more. Declan rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Old equipment, maybe. Atlas remained near the hatch area, still studying it with intense focus. Declan walked back and knelt again. He brushed dirt from the metal plate near the hatch. Something faint appeared beneath the rust. Letters. He wiped the surface more carefully with the sleeve of his jacket. Slowly the words became visible. U.S. Navy, Geological Survey Station, 1979. Declan stared at the letters for a long moment. The U.S. Navy had built something here, deep in the forest, over 40 years ago. And somehow, it had remained hidden all that time. Declan leaned back slightly. Geological survey, he murmured. Atlas stepped closer to the hatch. The dog's nose hovered just above the seam. Declan noticed something unusual. Atlas wasn't sniffing randomly. He was focusing on one specific point. Declan leaned closer. There, a thin line between the metal panels. Declan brushed away more soil. The seam widened. The hatch was slightly ajar. Not open, but not fully sealed either. Declan frowned. That's not storm damage. Someone had opened this before, or recently. The metal edge was cleaner than the surrounding rust. Declan stood slowly. The forest suddenly felt less empty. Atlas abruptly stepped back from the hatch. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of watching the forest, the German shepherd turned his head and looked directly at Declan. The dog held his gaze, longer than usual. Atlas had done this before, but only in certain moments. Moments when Declan had ignored him once, and paid for it. For a brief second, the memory returned with brutal clarity. Collapsed building. Smoke. Atlas barking. Declan raising his hand to silence him. Then the explosion. The dog's eyes in that moment had looked exactly the same. The same warning. The same certainty. Atlas broke the gaze and looked back at the hatch. Declan felt a quiet chill run along his spine. Not fear. Recognition. He understood what Atlas was saying. Be careful. Declan exhaled slowly. Yeah, he murmured. I hear you. He stepped closer to the hatch again. But this time he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Declan had spent enough years in dangerous environments to know when curiosity needed to wait. He studied the structure carefully instead. The hatch was round, about 3 feet across. Thick hinges along one side, the design looked familiar. Not military hardware exactly, but something close. A sealed access hatch, possibly for underground equipment. Declan stepped back again and scanned the surrounding slope. The structure had clearly been buried intentionally, not abandoned, buried. That meant someone had gone through the effort of hiding it. Declan looked toward the ridge above them. The storm had peeled away just enough soil to reveal the hatch. But the majority of the structure still lay underground. He considered his options. Opening a sealed Navy structure alone in the middle of the forest was not something he intended to do impulsively. Atlas watched him carefully. The dog had relaxed slightly, though his eyes never left the metal surface. Declan checked the sky. The afternoon sun was already drifting lower between the trees. They had been out longer than he realized. He stepped away from the hatch. All right, he said quietly. We're not rushing this. Atlas blinked slowly. Declan glanced once more at the faded lettering on the metal. U.S. Navy, 1979. The questions multiplied quickly in his mind. Why was a naval geological station buried miles from the coast? Why had it been sealed underground? And most importantly, who had opened the hatch? Declan turned and began walking back toward the trail. Atlas followed, though he glanced back once toward the buried structure before leaving the clearing. Declan noticed that too. Neither of them spoke, though the dog didn't need words. By the time they reached the edge of the clearing, Declan had already made his decision. He would come back tomorrow, prepared, with better equipment and more time. Behind them, the buried metal hatch remained partially exposed beneath the broken earth, waiting. Morning came gray and quiet. A thin fog hung low between the pines, turning the forest into layers of pale shadows and dark trunks stretching into the distance. The storm had passed days earlier, but the forest still felt unsettled, as if the land itself had not yet decided whether it wished to return to peace. Declan Voss stood outside the cabin, tightening the straps of his worn backpack. He had spent most of the previous night reading maps, old government archives, fragments of public records that most people would never bother to search. The information was incomplete, but one detail had stood out clearly enough to stop him from sleeping. In 1978, the U.S. Navy had purchased a remote section of forest in northern Washington for what official records called a seismic monitoring initiative. The project had operated for less than 5 years. Then in 1983, the entire site had been shut down. No reason listed, no closure report. The land had quietly returned to federal forest management as if the project had never existed. Declan had spent too many years around classified operations to ignore a silence like that. Something had happened, and whatever it was had been buried along with the station. Atlas sat beside the porch steps, watching Declan prepare. The German shepherd looked calm but alert, his ears occasionally shifting toward distant sounds in the forest. The dog was 8 years old now, old enough that the once bright tan fur around his muzzle had begun to fade slightly into pale gray. His body remained strong and balanced, though. The quiet strength of a working animal that had spent years running beside soldiers. Atlas never moved without purpose. Declan slung the pack onto his shoulder. Inside were several items he had chosen carefully. A high-powered flashlight, a 50-foot climbing rope, a compact crowbar, a military-grade air filtration mask he had kept since his last deployment. He had learned long ago that when opening something sealed, underground, caution wasn't optional. Atlas stood and walked beside him. "You don't like the idea," Declan said quietly. The dog glanced toward the forest. Declan followed the familiar trail toward the clearing where the metal structure waited beneath the soil. The walk took nearly 30 minutes. The path looked different now that he knew what lay hidden nearby. The forest was no longer just wilderness. It was a cover. When they reached the depression again, the metal structure sat exactly where he had left it. The exposed hatch caught faint light through the fog. Declan studied the area again. His instincts demanded confirmation. He walked slowly around the site. The ground showed no footprints besides their own from the previous day. No tire marks. No signs of recent human activity. The forest had reclaimed the place completely. Declan pulled a small GPS device from his pocket and marked the coordinates. Then he crouched and snapped several photos of the faded lettering. U.S. Navy Geological Survey Station, 1979. The letters looked even older in daylight. Atlas remained several feet away. The dog watched but refused to approach the hatch directly. Declan noticed. "You're drawing a line there, huh?" Atlas remained where he was. Declan turned his attention back to the hatch. The circular door resembled something designed for pressure sealing, like submarine access hatches, heavy, industrial. The storm had peeled enough earth away to expose the top portion, but the majority of the station remained buried beneath the slope. Declan set down his backpack and removed the crowbar. He inserted the metal tip into the small gap where the hatch had already been partially loosened. The metal creaked slightly. Rust shifted. Declan paused. He waited, listening. Nothing. Just wind brushing through the pines. He pulled harder. The hatch moved. Only an inch. But it moved. The seal had already weakened with age. Declan set the crowbar aside and pulled the air mask from his bag, fastening it carefully across his face. Atlas watched closely. Declan wrapped both hands around the hatch handle. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what you were hiding." He pulled. The metal door groaned as decades of rust scraped against the hinge. Slowly, reluctantly, the hatch opened. A rush of stale air escaped from the darkness below. Declan stepped back instinctively. Even through the mask, he could smell something old. Dust, metal, decay. He waited several seconds before approaching again. The opening revealed a narrow metal ladder descending into darkness. Atlas stepped forward slightly, but stopped again before reaching the edge. Declan turned on his flashlight. The beam cut through the opening. Concrete walls, steel reinforcement beams, a tunnel. Declan felt a quiet pulse of adrenaline. This was no simple monitoring station. It was an underground facility. He secured the rope around a nearby tree trunk and lowered the line into the opening as a backup. Old habits from military operations. Atlas sat near the entrance, watching every movement. Declan clipped the rope to his harness and stepped onto the ladder. The metal creaked under his weight. Dust drifted downward as he descended. 10 feet, 20, 30. Finally, his boots touched solid ground. The beam of his flashlight swept across the corridor. Concrete. Rusting pipes along the ceiling. Old electrical panels along one wall. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. No footprints. No movement. No sign of life. Declan removed one glove and touched the wall. Cold. Still. This place had been sealed for decades. Atlas suddenly barked once from above. The sound echoed sharply down the tunnel. Declan froze. Atlas almost never barked without reason. Declan turned his flashlight upward toward the ladder opening. For a brief moment, the beam illuminated the German shepherd standing above. But Atlas wasn't looking down at him. The dog was staring into the forest behind the clearing, completely motionless. Declan felt a tightening in his chest. Atlas had sensed something outside, something moving in the forest. But before Declan could climb back up to check, Atlas slowly sat down again. The dog's ears relaxed slightly. Whatever had caught his attention was gone, or had moved away. Declan remained still for a moment longer before exhaling slowly. "Easy," he murmured. He turned back toward the dark corridor. The underground station stretched farther than he expected. The corridor extended at least 40 feet before turning left. Old fluorescent light fixtures hung from the ceiling, long dead. A metal sign on the wall read, "Seismic Monitoring Lab, Level 1. Declan stepped forward cautiously. His boots stirred decades of dust. The first room he entered looked like an operations center. Old control panels lined the walls. Oscilloscope monitors. Paper recording drums used to track seismic activity. Most of the equipment had been stripped out, leaving only skeletal frames behind. But one thing caught his attention. A thick steel door stood at the far end of the room. Unlike the rest of the facility, this door looked newer. The metal showed far less corrosion. Declan approached it slowly. A faded warning sign remained bolted to the surface. Authorized personnel only, declassification pending. Declan frowned. The phrase felt strange. Whoever had sealed this facility had intended to return. but they never had. Declan ran his flashlight along the edges of the door. The hinges looked intact. The locking mechanism had rusted partly open. Declan stepped back and studied the corridor again. The entire station had clearly been abandoned quickly. Not dismantled, not demolished, simply closed. He glanced up toward the ladder shaft leading back to the forest. Atlas remained above, watching, waiting. Declan turned back toward the sealed steel door. Something deeper in the station waited beyond it. Something that had been locked away for more than 40 years. Declan rested his hand against the cold metal surface and listened. The underground corridor felt colder the farther Declan walked. His flashlight beam cut through suspended dust, illuminating fragments of a forgotten facility that had once hummed with purpose. Pipes ran along the ceiling like silent veins, their insulation cracked with age. Electrical conduits clung to the concrete walls, some hanging loose where brackets had rusted away. Declan moved slowly. Each step stirred faint echoes through the tunnel. Above him, the forest remained quiet. Atlas had stayed near the ladder opening, watching the clearing from above, though Declan knew the dog could descend in seconds if needed. The corridor sloped slightly downward before widening. Then Declan reached the end. The beam of his flashlight swept across a wide chamber. He stopped. The space before him was enormous compared to the narrow tunnel, a circular room carved into the earth, reinforced with thick concrete walls and steel supports. The ceiling arched overhead like the inside of an underground bunker. Rows of equipment lined the walls. Some machines had clearly been abandoned decades ago. Large drum recorders once used to trace seismic activity sat frozen in place, their paper rolls long yellowed and brittle. Analog control panels were coated in rust. Thick cables hung loosely across the floor. But not everything here was dead. Declan's eyes narrowed. On the far side of the chamber, a soft mechanical hum vibrated faintly through the air. Modern equipment. A portable generator sat against the wall, its casing scratched but recently maintained. LED indicators blinked steadily on a bank of contemporary computers connected to monitoring equipment. Digital seismic sensors. Satellite communication hardware. Declan's instincts sharpened instantly. Someone was using this place. He slowly lowered the beam of his flashlight. The generator was running quietly. Declan crouched beside it and examined the fuel line. Fresh, recently refilled. This station had not been abandoned after all. Atlas appeared at the edge of the tunnel entrance behind him. The German shepherd moved silently down the ladder and across the floor, his paws barely making a sound against the dusty concrete. Atlas stopped several feet behind Declan. The dog's body stiffened. A low rumble formed in his throat. Not loud, but unmistakable. A warning. Declan rose slowly. He didn't turn immediately. Instead, he listened. There. Footsteps. Soft. Approaching from a corridor on the opposite side of the chamber. Declan turned his flashlight toward the sound. A figure stepped into the beam. The man raised one hand slightly, shielding his eyes from the light. "Easy," the stranger said calmly. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who was not easily startled. Declan studied him carefully. The man appeared to be in his mid-50s, tall but slightly gaunt, as if he had spent years hunched over desks or laboratory equipment rather than living outdoors. His face was long and sharply angled, with high cheekbones and deep-set gray eyes that seemed constantly focused on something invisible just beyond the present moment. His hair had once been dark, but had faded into streaks of silver and charcoal, tied loosely at the back of his neck. A short, untrimmed beard framed his jaw, giving him the appearance of someone who had forgotten the small routines of normal life. He wore a worn technical jacket, dark gray, weather-resistant, over a neutral sweater and heavy work pants. Hiking boots coated with dry mud suggested he had been moving through the forest recently. The man lowered his hand slowly. "You must be the one who opened the hatch." Declan kept the flashlight steady. "And you must be the one running this place." The man nodded once. "Victor Hale." He stepped forward, stopping several feet away. Victor Hale moved with careful control, his posture upright but not threatening. There was something analytical about the way he studied Declan, as if he were evaluating variables in a problem rather than meeting a stranger. His gaze shifted briefly to Atlas. The dog stood still, muscles taut, golden brown eyes locked on the man. Victor raised an eyebrow. "That's a trained canine." Declan didn't answer immediately. Victor smiled faintly. "I've worked with military survey teams before. I recognize the posture." Declan lowered the flashlight slightly but kept his stance ready. "You've been using this station?" Victor nodded again. "For 3 years." Declan let that settle in. 3 years underground. Victor gestured around the chamber. "I found the facility by accident while studying regional seismic anomalies. At first I thought the structure had collapsed completely. But after clearing enough debris, I realized the station was mostly intact." Declan glanced at the modern computers. "You rebuilt it?" "Improvised," Victor corrected calmly. Atlas shifted slightly. The rumble in his throat grew deeper, Victor noticed. The geologist watched the dog for a moment before speaking again. "Your partner senses tension." Declan's voice remained neutral. "He senses dishonesty too." Victor's lips curved into a thin smile. "Then he should be calm." Victor walked toward one of the modern monitoring screens and tapped a key. The display flickered to life. A seismic graph appeared on the screen. Thin lines traced across the display like distant heartbeats. Victor pointed toward a cluster of unusual spikes. "These readings started 6 months ago." Declan stepped closer. The spikes were irregular, not natural tremors. Victor leaned slightly closer to the screen. "Something deep beneath this forest is moving." Atlas suddenly stepped forward. The German shepherd stared not at Victor, but at the floor beneath the equipment. The dog's ears snapped forward. Atlas slowly lowered his head toward the concrete. Then he froze. Declan followed the dog's gaze. For a moment, neither man spoke. Because faintly, almost imperceptibly, the floor vibrated. Just once, a low, distant tremor passing through the concrete like a pulse through stone. Atlas looked up at Declan. The dog's expression held the same silent certainty he always showed before danger appeared. The vibration stopped, but the feeling lingered in the air. Victor exhaled slowly. "There it is again." Declan straightened. "You knew that would happen." Victor nodded. "Not exactly when." He folded his arms. "But yes." Declan studied the screen again. "What exactly are we looking at?" Victor walked toward a large geological map pinned to the wall. The paper was covered in handwritten notes, layers of data points marked across the region. He tapped a section beneath the forest. "Deep beneath this ridge lies a massive geological formation." Declan remained silent. Victor continued. "Rare earth metals, possibly one of the largest deposits discovered in this region." Declan raised an eyebrow. "And no one believed you." Victor's smile faded slightly. "I presented the data to my company." His voice hardened. "They called it speculation." Declan waited. Victor's eyes darkened as he spoke. "I lost my research funding, my position, my reputation." The bitterness in his voice carried the weight of years. Victor gestured around the room again. So I came back here. Atlas remained near Declan, still watching the floor. Victor continued. The Navy built this station to monitor seismic activity related to underground mineral structures, but they shut it down before completing their research. Declan looked toward the sealed steel door at the far end of the chamber. You think the answers are down there? Victor followed his gaze. That section of the station goes deeper. He paused. The sensors show most of the seismic movement originates below that level. Declan glanced down again at Atlas. The dog had stopped, growling, but he still refused to move closer to the deeper corridor. Victor noticed the hesitation. Your dog is intelligent. Declan answered quietly. He listens to things we can't hear. Victor studied Atlas thoughtfully. Then perhaps he understands what I've been trying to prove. Declan folded his arms. And what exactly is that? Victor looked toward the steel door again. His voice dropped slightly. That something beneath this forest isn't just metal ore? The generator hummed quietly behind them. The seismic monitor continued drawing faint lines across the screen. And somewhere deeper beneath the station, the earth waited. The underground station had begun to feel alive. Not in the comforting way of a working facility, but in the uneasy way of something old being forced awake. Declan Voss stood near the central monitoring console, while Victor Hale adjusted a series of controls on one of the digital seismic scanners. The glow from the screens cast pale blue light across the concrete walls, turning the abandoned chamber into a strange mixture of past and present technology. Atlas remained near Declan's side. The German shepherd had not relaxed since they entered the deeper section of the station. His ears twitched constantly, reacting to faint sounds buried beneath the low mechanical hum of the generator. Victor leaned over a panel of instruments with the careful precision of someone who had spent most of his life in laboratories and field research sites. His long fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, adjusting data streams on the screen. For a moment, he looked almost young again. Obsessed, focused. Declan watched quietly. You've got all of this running at once, he said after a moment. Victor didn't look up. Yes. Declan glanced toward the older equipment along the walls. The original Navy seismic recorders, massive drum machines designed to measure underground vibrations decades earlier, had been reactivated. Their aging motors hummed weakly as paper charts slowly rolled forward beneath mechanical needles. But they were never meant to work alongside modern scanning systems. Declan folded his arms. That equipment is over 40 years old. Victor finally turned. The lines in his face deepened slightly. Machines age, he replied calmly, but physics doesn't. Declan stepped closer to the nearest monitoring display. What you're doing isn't just scanning. You're forcing the sensors to push signals through the rock. Victor didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded slowly. That's how you find structures buried deep beneath sediment layers. Declan stared at the rising data lines on the screen. The signals looked aggressive, sharp pulses traveling into the earth. He turned back toward Victor. These systems were designed to listen to the earth. Victor's voice remained steady. And sometimes the earth needs encouragement to answer. Declan exhaled quietly. The difference between science and recklessness was often thin. Atlas shifted beside him. The dog's body stiffened. Declan noticed immediately. Atlas's ears stood upright, his head tilted slightly toward the floor. The shepherd's thick black and tan coat rippled slightly as the muscles along his shoulders tightened. Something was changing. Declan stepped closer to one of the old Navy sensors mounted to the concrete floor. He placed his gloved hand against the metal housing. At first he felt nothing. Then, a faint vibration, like the distant rumble of thunder buried under stone. Declan looked back at Victor. You feel that? Victor studied the readings. Yes, but there was no concern in his voice, only fascination. Declan glanced toward the deeper corridor again. How long have you been running the system like this? Victor hesitated briefly. 6 weeks. Declan's jaw tightened. That's too long. Victor finally turned away from the screens. His eyes carried the stubborn determination of someone who had already sacrificed too much to turn back. You don't understand what's down there. Declan's voice remained calm. Maybe not. He gestured toward the monitors. But I understand pressure faults. Victor folded his arms. The seismic layers beneath this forest contain an enormous mineral formation. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. Rare earth metals, possibly enough to change the entire mining economy of the region. Declan didn't argue with the possibility. Geological formations like that existed, but disturbing them recklessly could be catastrophic. Atlas suddenly stepped forward. The German shepherd placed his nose near the floor again. Then he began pacing slowly. The dog's breathing deepened. His posture had changed completely. The fur along his spine rose slightly. Declan knew that reaction well. It meant Atlas sensed danger before it appeared. Atlas suddenly barked. The sound cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. Every machine in the room seemed to respond. At that exact moment, the seismic monitor spiked violently. The digital graph surged upward. Victor's eyes widened. The floor trembled. Not violently, but unmistakably. A deep metallic groan echoed through the structure as if the entire station had shifted slightly within the earth. The overhead lights flickered. Declan grabbed the edge of the console to steady himself. Atlas barked again, louder, urgent. The rumble beneath their feet grew stronger for a brief second before fading again. The monitors continued drawing frantic lines across the screens. Victor stared at the data in stunned silence. Then he whispered, "That wasn't natural movement." Declan didn't need confirmation. He already knew. The equipment had triggered it. Victor rushed toward the control console and began shutting down several scanning systems. His calm, scientific demeanor had vanished. Now, urgency replaced it. Declan moved quickly beside him. "Kill the whole system." Victor hesitated. "Not yet." Declan grabbed his arm. "Now." Victor looked toward the monitor. The readings continued climbing slowly. His jaw tightened. For the first time since Declan had met him, uncertainty entered his expression. Atlas began pacing faster. The German shepherd's claws scraped softly against the concrete floor. Another vibration passed beneath the station, this one stronger. A metallic shriek echoed from somewhere deep below. The sound resembled steel grinding against rock. Victor turned toward the far corridor. "That's coming from the lower levels." Declan shook his head. "We're done here." Victor stared at the monitor again. His voice dropped into a strained whisper. "I only need a few more days." Declan stepped closer. "You might not have a few more minutes." The lights flickered again. Dust fell lightly from the ceiling. A faint crack appeared along one section of concrete above the old seismic drum machines. Victor saw it too. For the first time, fear replaced obsession in his eyes. Atlas barked again. The monitor spiked once more. A violent screech erupted from the metal framework beneath the floor. Victor shut down the remaining systems. The generator continued humming, but the seismic pulses stopped. For a moment, the station fell into heavy silence. Then a loud crack echoed through the ceiling. A jagged fracture split across the concrete overhead. Declan grabbed his pack. "That's it." Victor didn't argue. He stared at the spreading crack for half a second longer. Then he nodded. "You were right." Declan clipped the rope harness back onto his belt. Save it for later. Atlas was already moving toward the ladder. The German shepherd didn't look back. He moved with absolute certainty now, the way he did when danger was close. Victor grabbed a small case of data drives from the console. Years of research. He stuffed it into his pack. Another vibration rippled through the structure. Chunks of concrete dust fell from the ceiling. Declan pushed Victor toward the ladder. Move! The three of them rushed down the corridor toward the access shaft. Behind them, the old Navy station groaned under the growing pressure of shifting rock. Above, the forest waited. But beneath the earth, something had already begun to move. The tunnel shook like a living thing trying to break free. Declan Voss ran. His boots slammed against the concrete floor as the underground corridor rattled with violent vibrations. Dust poured from the ceiling in pale clouds, turning the narrow passage into a choking haze. Behind him, Victor Hale stumbled forward, clutching the case of hard drives to his chest as if the metal box contained his entire life, which, in many ways, it did. Atlas ran ahead. The German shepherd moved like a shadow through the chaos, his powerful body weaving around fallen equipment and scattered debris. His paws struck the floor with quiet precision, even as the station groaned under pressure. Another violent tremor passed through the structure. The sound that followed was worse. A deep metallic scream echoed through the tunnel as steel reinforcement beams twisted somewhere in the depths of the station. Declan grabbed Victor's arm and shoved him forward. Keep moving! Victor's breathing had turned ragged. The scientist who had spent years studying quiet vibrations beneath the earth now found himself running through the consequences of those same forces. Above them, the ceiling cracked again. A jagged line split across the concrete like lightning frozen in stone. Atlas suddenly stopped. The dog turned sharply. Declan almost collided with him. What? Atlas lunged forward and grabbed the sleeve of Declan's field jacket. Not aggressively, but firmly. The shepherd pulled backward. Declan froze. He had seen Atlas do that before, only when something was seconds away from happening. Declan instinctively stepped back. Victor stumbled beside him in confusion. Why are we stopping? Declan didn't answer, because Atlas had already answered. The ceiling collapsed. A massive slab of concrete crashed down directly where Declan would have been standing. The impact exploded into dust and shattered fragments of steel mesh. Victor stared at the fallen debris in stunned silence. Declan placed a hand briefly on Atlas's shoulder. Good call, he murmured. But there was no time to stand still. Another rumble rolled through the corridor. Declan pointed ahead. Move! They sprinted the final stretch toward the access shaft. The ladder came into view through the dust. Atlas leaped up first, climbing the metal rungs with quick, practiced movements. The dog had done similar drills years ago during military search operations. Declan followed. Victor climbed after him, slower but desperate. The entire tunnel groaned beneath them as they climbed toward daylight. Declan pushed open the hatch with his shoulder and rolled out onto the forest floor. Fresh air rushed into his lungs. Atlas stood beside him immediately, turning toward the slope as Victor scrambled out seconds later. Then the ground shifted, not violently, but enough to make the forest floor tremble. Declan pulled Victor away from the opening just as the soil around the hatch collapsed inward. The earth sank several feet with a deep grinding sound. A section of the buried station gave way beneath the hillside. The hatch disappeared as dirt and broken roots slid into the cavity below. Within seconds, the entire depression collapsed into a jagged sinkhole. Dust drifted slowly upward through the pine branches. Silence followed. Declan stared at the broken earth. The underground station was gone. Atlas stood beside him, ears upright, watching the settling soil. Victor knelt near the edge of the collapse, breathing heavily. His shoulders trembled. Declan expected anger, denial. But Victor only stared into the hole where years of research had vanished. Finally, he exhaled slowly. I pushed too far. Declan didn't argue, because the ground beneath them answered with another faint rumble. Not dangerous now, just the earth resettling. Victor stood slowly. His face looked older than it had an hour earlier. For the first time since Declan met him, the stubborn obsession in his eyes had faded. In its place was quiet realization. Atlas walked to the edge of the collapsed ground and sniffed the air. Then he stepped back calmly. The danger had passed. For now. As the dust finally settled, Atlas suddenly turned toward the forest. The dog's ears rose sharply. Declan followed his gaze. For a moment, nothing moved among the tall pines. Then Atlas relaxed again. But something about the moment lingered. Declan realized the dog wasn't reacting to danger this time. He was listening to something distant, something deeper than the collapsing station. Declan glanced once more toward the sinkhole. For the briefest moment, he wondered whether the tremors had truly ended, or if the forest had simply grown quiet again. The next morning, the clearing looked completely different. Sheriff Lena Morrissey arrived shortly after sunrise with 2 county rescue trucks and a team of structural engineers. Lena Morrissey stepped out of the lead vehicle with the calm authority of someone accustomed to crisis scenes. She was 39 years old, with dark brown hair tied tightly behind her head and sharp, observant eyes that missed very little. Her sheriff's uniform was partially hidden beneath a thick forest green jacket, and her posture carried the steady confidence of a law enforcement officer who had spent years solving problems in remote rural territory. She studied the sinkhole carefully. "Well," she said quietly, "that's not something we see every day." Declan stood nearby with Atlas sitting beside him. Victor sat on the back of a rescue vehicle while a deputy took notes. Lena crouched near the collapsed ground and examined the exposed metal fragments. One of the engineers approached her moments later. A tall man named Robert Gaines, an aging geotechnical specialist with silver hair and weathered skin from decades of fieldwork. Gaines adjusted his glasses as he studied the exposed steel beams. This was definitely a Cold War seismic monitoring station, he confirmed. Lena glanced toward Declan. "You find it?" Declan nodded. "And it found trouble." Gaines continued his inspection. "If those sensors had kept running," he said gravely, "the resonance could have triggered a serious landslide across the ridge." Lena straightened slowly. "That close?" Gaines nodded. "Within weeks, maybe sooner." She looked toward Victor. The former geologist sat quietly, hands resting on his knees. 2 deputies approached him. Victor didn't resist as they helped him to his feet. He had the tired expression of a man who had spent years chasing proof, only to lose everything the moment it finally appeared. As the deputies escorted him toward the patrol vehicle, Victor paused. His eyes shifted toward Atlas. The German shepherd sat calmly beside Declan. Victor studied the dog for a moment. Then he said quietly, "That animal sensed the tremors before every instrument I built." Declan nodded once. Atlas didn't react. Victor gave a faint, tired smile before stepping into the vehicle. The door closed. The patrol car pulled away slowly along the forest road. By late afternoon, most of the emergency vehicles had left. The forest returned to its usual quiet rhythm. That night, Declan sat on the wooden steps outside his cabin. The sky above the trees had turned deep blue as evening settled across the mountains. Atlas lay beside him. The dog rested quietly but remained alert, his eyes occasionally scanning the tree line. Declan leaned back against the railing. For a long time, neither of them moved. The memories came slowly. A dusty street in a distant war zone. Atlas barking. Declan raising his hand to silence him, and the explosion that followed. For years, the guilt had followed him everywhere. He had ignored the one partner who had never been wrong. Tonight felt different. Declan reached down and placed his hand gently on the shepherd's head. Atlas looked up at him. For the first time in years, Declan allowed himself a small smile. "Thanks for not giving up on me," he said quietly. Atlas blinked slowly. Then he turned his gaze back toward the dark forest, ears upright, watching, like a soldier still standing guard. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, standing beside us every day. A loyal dog, a warning we almost ignore, a second chance we never expected. In this story, Declan survived not because he was stronger or smarter, but because he finally chose to listen. And perhaps that moment was not only instinct, perhaps it was something greater. Many people believe that God rarely speaks directly. Instead, he places signs in our lives, through people, through moments, through quiet instincts that tell us when something is wrong or when it is time to stop. Sometimes those signs come through the ones who never leave our side. Maybe you have experienced something like that in your own life. A moment when something, or someone, protected you when you did not even realize the danger. Perhaps that was not coincidence. Perhaps it was grace. Life moves quickly, and we often forget to pause and listen to the small warnings, the quiet voices, the subtle guidance placed in our path. But stories like this remind us that faith, loyalty, and awareness can save us when we least expect it. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Have you ever experienced a moment when you felt protected, guided, or saved in a way that felt like a miracle? Your story may encourage someone else who is watching right now. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with someone who loves stories about courage, loyalty, and the unseen ways that grace appears in our lives. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next one. Before you leave, may God watch over you and your family. May He guide your path, protect you in unseen ways, and place the right people and moments in your life exactly when you need them. Thank you for watching.